It's an immutable fact that guys like trains. And I think we all get imprinted when we're 7 and get a train set around the Christmas tree. But for some of us, it doesn't wear off and becomes a lifelong obsession, but not a bad one. And that's true of me. So I'm building a railroad that I will show you shortly. I lived in Hawaii for 15 years, and while there I became fascinated with the remains of the Oahu Railway that used to run around the island. I was the chief engineer for the cable company there. I got to know every back road, every street, every little hamlet on the island. And I kept finding evidence of a long forgotten railroad, pieces of rail across a piece of blacktop with nothing else and a little bit of abandoned equipment, and began kind of researching what had been there. So I'd like to show some photographs and sort of talk about the history of the railroad a little bit and where it's led. The company was the Oahu Railway and Land Company, and it was started in 1889 and ran until 1947. It was a big deal on the island, as railroads were everywhere before there were good roads and so forth. My idea was it seemed like the perfect railroad to build a model of. And I began gathering information, going to museums and so forth, getting photographs, maps, drawings, and talking to old people who had ridden the railroad or even worked on the railroad. That was my pastime while I was in Hawaii, and I've pursued it since. This is a map of the island. And in red is the route of the railroad from Honolulu, down by this little harbor here, out around Pearl Harbor and around the island to all of the sugar plantations. And all the green areas are sugar plantations, each with a sugar mill. And there's little spider-like lines through the green. And those are the cane haul railroads. Each mill had its own little railroad to haul cane in from the fields to the mill. Then there's a branch that goes up to the middle of the island to Wahiawa, and the yellow areas were pineapple fields. The higher elevation, more rain, and the railroad served those as well. This is a map of Honolulu Harbor. Again, this is in the late 1920s. You see quite a complex of boat slips and tracks. Up here is the passenger station for the railroad, the roundhouse and the shops, a variety of service facilities, and then all the piers. And then there's a pineapple cannery. The American Can Company had a plant here. They brought in big rolls of steel from the mainland, tin plate, made cans out of them, and then sent the cans over to the pineapple canneries. So very busy complex, and this was the heart of economic activity for the territory of Hawaii for a long time. This is the passenger station, built in the 20s, in the heyday of the railroad, Mediterranean style. It's actually still there. It's now some city offices, but quite an elegant building. And right out front were the trolley tracks. People could take the trolley to the train station and then take the train around the island. In terms of economic drivers, sugar was the big deal. And this is one of these cane haul railroads, hauling cane in to the mill behind a little locomotive. And at the mill, there'd be lots of cane brought in and dumped into a big conveyor, went through big rollers, which crushed the cane and captured the juice. The juice was boiled under a vacuum and the molasses separated, and they wound up with burlap sacks full of raw sugar. And the mills were these huge, noisy, smelly operations, and the output were bags of sugar that were put in boxcars and taken down to the docks and loaded in ships taken to Martinez on the Sacramento River, where they were further refined into white sugar. That made huge fortunes. People who owned land and had access to irrigation water in Hawaii got very, very rich. Then there was pineapple, and up in the heights, pineapple fields, and at harvest, workers would cut the pineapple off the plant, load them in crates. The crates would be loaded on little carts pulled by mules to the nearest railroad siding. And then they'd stack the crates on flat cars and take them down to the three canneries. Dole, Del Monte, and Libby all had canneries in Honolulu. And this is where our mothers got the little round pineapple rings for our pineapple upside down cake and hams. So another thriving business, but lots of pineapple. And then the pineapple canneries themselves were highly automated with conveyors and machines to cut and slice the pineapples and get them ready to go into cans. This is the Dole Pineapple Cannery, which had a giant water tower shaped like a pineapple, which I intend to model eventually. It was a landmark for a long time. They finally tore it down. This is one of the docks where the trains would go out and load stuff onto and off of steamers that would come into Honolulu. Again, an island territory, and ocean travel and cargo was the lifeblood. This is a passenger train coming into Honolulu, a bunch of sailors getting off. And the station was very close to the red light district in Honolulu, so no shortage of traffic on weekends. The railroad had 31 steam locomotives, beautiful locomotives, very well tended. This is the roundhouse and turntable. Big locomotives, small locomotives. The locomotives hauled the trains around the island. To get up to the pineapple fields, it was a long grade, so they would use sometimes 2 or 3 locomotives to pull the train up the hill. And they experimented for a while with these geared locomotives that had a lot of traction, but they were slow and were a maintenance headache and went by the wayside. But I've got a couple of models of them. And this is one of the really big locomotives they had, which are very similar to the locomotives that you might see in Durango, Colorado, where they've got a tourist ride now. This was all narrow gauge, but it was kind of heavy duty narrow gauge. So the tracks were 3 feet apart. It was cheaper to build than standard gauge. And since it didn't interconnect with anything, being on an island, that made lots of sense. And this is the locomotive servicing facility that put water in the locomotives and oil. They all burned oil, an elaborate facility. You see some flowers here. The Dillingham family, Ben Dillingham was the founder of the railroad, and his family took great pride in the railroad. So even down by the turntable, they had flowers and a lawn that they mowed. It was a little fancier than most railroads. But the Dillinghams made a fortune, as well as the people who owned sugar land and pineapple land.
The locomotives were internal combustion engines?
External combustion. They burned oil in a firebox. They boiled water, and the steam from the boiled water was used to drive the pistons that drove the locomotive. This is a train coming past some watercress fields and rice paddies. This is a junction out in the countryside with a passenger train coming in. And this is old Ben Dillingham's private car. And he was, as I said, the founder and the president of the railroad, and his son was the president after him. Visiting dignitaries would be toured around the island in this car. Calvin Coolidge and others were photographed on this car. And this is an inter-island steamer that was used to haul passengers and various kinds of freight between the islands. Most of the meat in Hawaii was raised on the ranches on the Big Island, with very few good harbors. So on the ranches, the cowboys, the Paneolos, would drive the cattle down into the water and then swim on their horses with the cattle out to these little ships. They'd swing the boom over the side and put down a sling, and the Paneolo would get a sling under the belly of the cow, would be lifted up and into the hold of the ship for transport back to the slaughterhouses in Honolulu. The Paneolos were very skilled at this, and they were very careful. The important thing, I'm told, was not to swim your horse under a cow. As cows would get excited and kind of let go on their way up as they were being lifted out of the water, and didn't want to be under that. This is a portion of a timetable, but during the peak of the railroad's operation, there were 18 trains a day inbound and 18 outbound from Honolulu. So lots and lots of passenger trains. And then there were lots of scheduled freights as well. And then during pineapple harvest season, there'd be 70 trains a day just of pineapples coming down the hill to the canneries. Sophisticated railroad, they built a double track main line, they had automatic block signals. So it was like a class 1 mainland railroad, except it was just on this little tiny island. So I gathered all this information over the years, and then a friend in Hawaii suggested that we get together and publish a history of the railroad. And this is a watercolor that I had done by a railroad artist. It's on the cover of this book. We printed 5,000 copies of the book, and there are a few hundred left. So sold lots and lots and lots of books. If I sell the remaining books, I will come close to break even if you don't count labor. So not a great business, but very satisfying. These books are in libraries all over the place. The markets primarily were people interested in Hawaiian history and train nuts. And they still sort of trickle out on Amazon. Part of my life goal is to get rid of all the rest of the books. So in the meantime, in addition to collecting all this background material, I began planning my model railroad. In boring corporate meetings before I retired, I came up with this scheme of tracks and so forth, with the passenger station and the roundhouse and the Dole pineapple cannery with the water tower shaped like a pineapple and so forth. And so 14 years ago, I began building this thing in my basement. And it started off with a room in the basement. It's 22 by 33 feet and a bunch of sheets of plywood and lots and lots of sawdust and carpentry, building the framework for the railroad, two different layers, two different levels, so I could fit more into the room. Lots of laminating roadbed. And then I had to build a way for the trains to get from the lower level to the upper level. So I decided to build what's called a helix, a spiral ramp that goes from the low level to the high level, laminated together a bunch of plywood, and then assembled it into this helix, laminated together the roadbed for the tracks, built some custom track work, soldering rails down to printed circuit board ties. This is a lifetime project, and who's in a hurry? When I installed the turntable, it was a puzzle as to how to make it turn. And a friend with a laser cutter offered to help me, and he cut out a plastic mechanism, and it's got a little stepper motor here, and then a cogged belt that goes around this big laser cut gear. So it was a nice way to get a bunch of gear reduction without having a lot of slop between the gears, and it's worked out very well. I also wanted to have some storage tracks, and I've got a whole shelf with tracks on it that is moved by these screws. There are two screws with stepper motors and a little Arduino controller that slides this big shelf in and out so the tracks line up. So here's some pictures of the railroad. There's Diamond Head in the background, and I'll talk about the backdrops in a few minutes. And here's a wharf. And then again, my campmate David Dreyfus helped me. We went online and we found a guy in Indonesia who takes drone photographs of coral reefs. We bought a copy of this very high resolution photograph, and David printed it out on his big inkjet printer. We photoshopped in a few sharks and turtles just to liven it up. And then I put it down on my railroad and poured resin over it. And that's the lagoon beside the wharf with the rails on it to ship things around the island. And then this is the passenger station. I found in the corporate records of the railroad, I found the blueprints for the station. So we built a scale model of the station, and you can see that it had an open air waiting room. And if you peer inside, on the wall of the waiting room is a timetable and a system map of the railroad. And the railroad itself goes out through the countryside, sugarcane, sugar mills. There's a pineapple plantation, which we'll see in a second, and these backdrops. So I'm in my workshop. And one of the joys of this hobby is that you get to buy lots of tools. So I've got woodworking tools and metalworking tools and a big collection of railroad books and just everything you might need to build a giant railroad. And lots of tools. A little cave here off the basement where I've got a few old machine tools, a punch press and a brake and a bandsaw and a drill press. So just what every engineer needs in their basement.
Much too clean.
Well, it's not always like this.
Much too clean, much too organized.
Jim, does your wife encourage this behavior?
My wife's a potter. She has a studio of her own out over the garage. So it's kind of a negotiation.
Judy
Kind of
has
a
her own. Judy has her own thing going on. Believe me.
That's kind of a negotiated settlement. So here's my model building bench. So lots of adhesives and files and pliers and cutters and so forth. Someone asked me if I really need all these different kinds of pliers, and they're actually very specialized. There's one to cut rail on track, and there's another to drive spikes. And so again, a great excuse to buy tools. So that's my shop, and got lumber storage and so forth. But this is the portal to the train room, and this is the model railroad. And just looking around for a second, we've got these backdrops, and in here you're in Honolulu in 1929. So fields and backdrops, and the backdrops are actually an interesting story. When I was researching for the book in the state archives, I found these great panoramic photographs that were taken in the late 20s. And it was kind of a rage back then. They had these big mechanical cameras, large format cameras that would pull wide film past a slot as a clockwork mechanism that turned the camera. And you wound up with these great big, very high resolution photographs. So I shot them digitally and stitched them together with Photoshop and colorized them. And then I found a sign company that prints out signs to wrap buses with here in Denver. And they printed out these backdrops 3 feet high, and this one's 80 feet long. They were printed out on adhesive back vinyl, and I put it up around the room, and it gives this feeling of Honolulu back then. So here's the station. Here's our Back to the Future car. The sharks are swimming in the lagoon, and I'm building a model here of a barge that hauled oil between the islands. And I'm going to start up one of our trains. So we've got a train leaving the station and going out through the Honolulu yards. Got a freight shed and a roundhouse and a turntable and the yards full of railroad cars. And the backdrop. Trudy and I used to live back up in this valley. And this green splotch is Oahu Country Club. They were, the folks who owned the sugar plantations were playing golf in the 20s. So lots of sidings, yards. Here comes another train moving slowly. One of those geared locomotives. And back in the corner here, there's a construction project. I'm building this big complex that was the Dole Pineapple Cannery. It's sort of only barely begun, but there are going to be lots of buildings. The Pineapple Water Tower. This whole corner will be filled with structures. The tracks actually go into the pineapple cannery, and they'll be hidden, but they cross over and go through the backdrop, and they pop out in the pineapple fields. So the idea is you have a train full of pineapples, you push it into the cannery, it vanishes into the pineapple field, and then you pull a train full of empty crates out of the cannery and go back through the railroad and get more pineapples. So it's a reason for the railroad to exist. Then around through the countryside of Oahu, with Pearl Harbor in the background. And the locomotives, by the way, all have sound chips in them. so that they generate sound inside the locomotive, and they've got little programs. They blow off steam and have whistles and so forth. So around past another sugar mill, and we come to the pineapple plantation. And there are 2,000 pineapple plants here. Ask me how I know. Made them from sisal twine, cut in little pieces and fluffed up and airbrushed. And each one has a little pineapple in it. And the pineapples are 3D printed. I've got a friend with a 3D printer who printed up blocks of 100 pineapples and printed me several thousand pineapples. So I put pineapples in the pineapple plants and also on the pineapple cars. So the pineapple cars are have stacks of crates full of pineapples. And then there are stacks of empty crates to go back to coming into the field, and full crates going out of the field. After I did the 2,000 pineapple plants, I decided I needed more. So I put up a mirror and I've instantly got 2,000 more pineapple plants. And again, the backdrop is the backdrop behind the pineapple fields, again, taken in the 20s. And I did my best to blend the pineapple plants in the foreground into the fields in the background. Lots and lots of flat cars here. I need to make lots more crates to fill all these cars up. In the video we saw in the beginning, the train left the pineapple field and went down this gulch, which is a steep grade on its way back to Honolulu. And I've just climbed up some steps. So I'm now up on the upper level of the train layout. And the track to Honolulu vanishes into a tunnel. But now I'm up here. I'm in what will become a giant sugar plantation with a sugar mill and lots of sugar cane, and there'll be a little village for the plantation workers and so forth. And there'll be some little tracks to go out into the cane fields to get cane. Now, I mentioned that helix to get to the upper level. There's this big structure here where the tracks go round and round and round and up a gradual grade to get up to this upper level. And inside the helix is sort of wasted space, or a secret room. I've told Trudy I'm going to put an easy chair in there and an ashtray and smoke cigars there. Watch the trains go around. So headed back down the steps to the lower level. Underneath the layout, I've got these hidden tracks where I can store trains. And I mentioned this one area. This is that shelf that's motorized. So there's a little control panel here, and if I turn the knob, then the stepper motors start running, and this 11-foot shelf slides out and aligns the track with the next track, and I can roll the train off the storage track and onto the railroad. So not absolutely necessary, but that absorbed like a year's effort and was a lot of fun. So in any event, this is where I spend sort of snowy winter afternoons. And hopefully we're going to get another one of those this weekend. And I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have about my railroad. So if you have questions, unmute yourself. And Peter.
When do you expect to finish this project?
Well, the goal is to finish it the day before you die. It's a lifetime project, and you don't want to be in a rush, because finishing, I'm not sure what would happen if I actually finished it. I'd be fearful to find out. But there's plenty to do here to last me decades more. And for me at least, this is one of the keys to keeping young.
One more question. Do you eat pineapples?
Sure. I never worked in the cannery, so I still like pineapples. I remember driving past the cannery when it was in operation, though, and there was this hot, sweet, not good smell coming out of it. And so it was not a pleasant place to work. And they primarily did harvest in the summer so they could get high school kids. And they'd either work in the cannery or they'd work in the fields. Both quite unpleasant, but they needed labor. Labor relations have always been interesting in Hawaii, and cheap labor was key to all these industries. And so part of the strategy of the plantation owners was to bring in subsequent waves of immigrants to work the fields. I guess initially it was Japanese, and then Chinese, then Filipinos. And for overseers, they brought in Portuguese from the Azores. But there was always a lot of tension around all that. And each wave of immigrants would eventually get off the plantation and enter civic life and go to school and open stores and all the rest. But it's part of the whole story of Hawaii being a melting pot. Once the trade barriers to the US fell, then Hawaii no longer could compete with either pineapple or sugar. And so free trade was kind of the end to all this. But along the way, I mean, there were strikes and all kinds of stuff between the workers and the owners. And of course, then there were all the maritime strikes. So Hawaii's got an interesting social history and an interesting labor history.
Did you build the locomotives and the cars and stuff?
Mostly, I've bought models of Colorado narrow gauge equipment and then modified it to be like the Hawaiian equipment. I've built some cars. Locomotives are a big deal to build from scratch. There are people who do it, but I just modify stuff and paint it and put decals on it, stuff like that.
But they're basically reflective of the technology at the time, or the kinds of locomotives they would be using in those days.
Oh, absolutely. If you get the book, you'll see I've got a whole section with one or two pictures of every locomotive, and I have drawings. There's all kinds of resources. So I try to match these to the actual locomotives and cars that were used on the railroad. And then in each locomotive, when I get them, they just run on DC power. So I modify them. I put a chip in each one that controls the locomotive, picks up signals from the track, controls the locomotive, and generates the sounds. And the chips are very sophisticated. You program them. You can build in momentum, and you can make the brakes squeal when it slows down. And there's really no end to it. It's actually a sizable hobby, and this is in many ways the golden age of the model railroad hobby. People the age of most of us grew up, some of them interested in trains, and now they're retired and have time and money, and they build big model railroads. They start little companies to make specialized stuff for model train things. I suspect that in 30 years, a lot of that will be all gone, because I don't think kids today are so much into trains. But it's a good time to be in the hobby. There's lots of stuff available. It's an interesting place to live, and I know a lot of you have at least visited there. James Michener, who wrote Hawaii, thought that Hawaii was a glimpse into mankind's utopian future, with intermarriage and with the golden people and all this. Peter, thank you for setting this up. I was eager to do it again, and I'm glad to have it recorded, so now I can try to post it and not have to do it over and over again. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jim. That was terrific.
Keep young.
Always.
Indeed.